Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin with the land acknowledgement. Western Arts Alliance is based on the traditional unceded lands of the bands of Chinook, the Clackamas, the Cathlamet, the Molalla, the Multnomah, and the Tualatin Kalapuya. We are at this intersection of two great rivers, this confluence of two great rivers that brought many tribal nations together here in this area that we now call Portland. And we want to pay our respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge their stewardship of this land for millennia and for generations to come. We are delighted that you're joining us this morning for this important conversation. And I want to start off by saying that we have added a content warning for this session because some of the conversation will involve reference to threats of violence, sexual assault, stalking, and murder. So I wanted to sort of alert everybody that this will be a kind of a frank and sort of open conversation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Antonio Gomez, who is the board vice president and the director of community engagement and extended learning for the Tacoma Arts Live, a brand new title for Tony. So I'm still getting used to it. Tony, thank you for moderating today.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome everyone. I am feeling both excited and a little trepidatious about this conversation today. It is a necessary conversation. It's not an easy conversation. And we're going to be leaning into territory that can be triggering for a lot of folks, and sometimes not for the same reasons. We may be impacted on this by our positionality as it relates to gender, race, ethnicity, our geography, our politics. So a lot of different ways, and again, not always in the same way. So as we start this conversation, I would like to invite everyone to join us in establishing some ground rules, which are really about how we hold space together, even if we are not fully aligned in what we believe or what we perceive, and or how we interpret things. And so some of the ground rules for today, I'm going to ask everyone to embody empathy, and or actually at least embody respect. So we're looking at how can we engage in respectful conversation, respectful dialogue, even when our buttons might get pushed. I'm asking everyone to embrace difference, to sit with the idea of being in community, even being in community sometimes with others who may have a point of view that's completely different from our own, and for us to practice sitting in discomfort, and that momentary discomfort, even in this immediate gratification society, momentary temporary discomfort is part of a learning process and a reconciliation process, in that we will, when we have something that is concerning to us or even something that upsets us, I'm going to ask that we refrain from vilifying language and we use questions. In other words, the challenge is to not look at each other if we have opposing views, look at each other as two-dimensional on-screen characters that are easy to put into a box, but to embrace kind of the fully multi-dimensional aspect of everyone in the conversation, which can be really hard. It's kind of like Thanksgiving dinner, but with the whole Western Arts Alliance Association. So with that, I want to go ahead and do some introductions. I am joining you today from the lands of the Puyallup Nation, also known as Tacoma, Washington. And as Tim mentioned, I work at Tacoma Arts Live, and I work mainly in the space of community engagement and education. I'm also honored to be part of the board at WAA. And I also work as a musician. So I've been studying and performing music from the Afro-Latin diaspora and from the Mediterranean, both sides of the Mediterranean, for many years. And so work also as on the touring musician side of the equation sometimes. I'm thrilled to introduce our panel, and I'm going to ask them to take a minute or two to introduce themselves. Let's start with Teresa Martinez.
So hello, my name is Teresa Martinez. I also answer to Teresa. And I come from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I am a professor at the University of Utah. So I basically spent most of my life in the West. And I'm excited to be here. I'm a sociologist. I'm a free range sociologist. And so I kind of come to this discussion with ideas about the West and the history and culture of the West.
Thank you, Teresa. And Iquail.
Awesome. Iquel Shahid is my name. I am on Lenape land, also known as Philadelphia, which is my birth city. And I'm happy to call in from there. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an African-American man of dark skin with a short crop cut hair, a deep raspy voice today that's affected by some sickness. So I apologize for the low tone and the raspiness. But it is what it is. I am happy to be here. I do my work with and for social change, using dance as sort of the catalyst and the connective tissue to make the sort of changes we want to see in the world. So that includes performances, productions, but really this idea of reworlding and using dance to bring people into spaces and talk about these differences, but not only to talk about them, but put them into situations in society where they can actually do the difference and do the change. So I'm happy for that. I know on the pre-call, we talked about favorite shows. So I'll just say that my favorite show right now is P-Valley, which just ended its second season. Katori Hall is a genius. And it really just showcases what I hope we're about to engage in, which is the multidimensionality of people, the multifaceted nature and complex, nuanced human beings from the Black perspective and the Black woman perspective in particular. So, so I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Iquel. And those low tones, we'll call those dulcet tones. All right, Camille.
Not Kathleen Turner after smoking a pack of cigarettes. I'm Camille Berger. I'm the Director of Community Enrichment at the College of Southern Idaho, which was built on the ancestral lands of the Shoshone-Bannock tribe. As for part of community education, we do enrichment classes for adults, offer speakers, youth camps, and then we have our performing arts series, which is where my connection with WAA comes in. I think I've been going to WAA for nigh on 25 years now, but most notably for the purposes of this panel, I live in a very, very polarized community.
Thank you, Camille. Thank you. And thanks for all the panelists in terms of bringing your perspective and your experience to this discussion. I want to start off kind of setting the scene, and Teresa, as the kind of the resident sociologist on the panel, would you help us kind of understand what is the state of polarization in the West right now?
Well, to say that it's extreme would not be an overstatement, but also this is a very long-standing history. So let's jump in there. So I'm going to kind of use a model that's based on the scholarship of Colin Woodward, who has this wonderful book called American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. And so I'm using him and I'm using other social scientists. So let's start with what he calls the Far West. Now, interestingly, we're all part of the Far West. Well, I mean, okay, some of us are part of the Far West. I definitely am living in the Far West right now. He considers that the West halves of the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas, as well as Idaho, Montana, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada. There's a long-standing history of rugged and romantic individualistic frontier life. You hear Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in there? Yes. Also ties to the Deep South, both politically and economically. Much of the land of the Far West was not in the hands of, was that was not in the hands of railroad companies, mining companies, and granted to American Indian nations, was in the hands of the federal government, which bred a long, intense history of resentment of the federal government in the far West. And their alliance with the Deep South managed to weaken federal stewardship of far Western resources, but this increased corporate dominance over the nation. So the far West includes Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Utah, Nevada. Then there's the left coast, and that's kind of aptly discussed as the left coast. That includes California all the way to Alaska. It includes California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. This is a strong strain of New England intellectualism and idealism that combines a Yankee faith in good government and social reform with a commitment to individual exploration and self-discovery. The left coast is the birthplace of the modern environmental movement, the information revolution, and co-founders of the peace movement, the gay rights movement, and the cultural revolution of the 1960s. We've all heard of the counterculture and the hippie counterculture of the left coast. And then there's El Norte, which is where basically I hail from. So this is South and West Texas, Southern California, and Imperial Valley, Southern Arizona, New Mexico, all of New Mexico, parts of Colorado, and also northern Mexican states of Coahuila, Chihuahua, Sonora, and others, and Baja California. This is the oldest of the American nations where Latinx language and culture and heritage dominates societal norms. It's called the borderlands. It's also called Norteño culture. A little known fact is that most American Western icons originate in El Norte and were based on Spanish precedents. So the terms lasso, lariat, reata, chaps, chapareras, 10-gallon hats or sombreros, buckaroo is vaquero, mustang is mesteño, stampede is estampida, ranch is rancho, rodeo, bronco, can I go on? This is a culture that was remote for a great deal of American history, but then annexed brutally in a war by the US, which did everything it could to destroy and suppress this culture. Norteños, like myself, have been subjected to discrimination, disenfranchisement, and a massive cultural challenge from their new overlords, yet would survive a century of occupation to challenge subjugation in the late 20th century. And then, of course, there's First Nation, American Indians, native peoples that are both in Canada as well as North America. The West is the home to the largest population of Indigenous Americans, as well as significant populations of Asian immigrants, which I haven't even touched on. All of these fascinating historical antecedents have come to the fore. I mean, you can hear them: far West, left coast, El Norte, and the First Nations. All of these come together in an embroilment of distinct political resentments, hatreds. I mean, Utah's red, California is blue, and these are very blue and very red states, right? So the rivalries are intense. The resentments go back centuries, and they're still with us, and they're still living within us, and we're all still playing them out. And the election of 2016, the election of, the recent election, 2020, all of these, my gosh, January 6th, all of these are mapped out in discussions in the left coast and the far West and El Norte and among native indigenous folks here. So very intense rivalries, long-standing resentments, long-standing hatreds. This is what's going on historically, geographically. A little bit of background.
Thank you, Teresa, and that historical context is very helpful. I mean, and as we talk about the West, these histories do set the table in terms of what does one of America's first imperial efforts, the Mexican-American War, mean for the West, and what does the Great Northern Migration of African American families from the South to cities like Oakland, Portland, Tacoma, and Seattle, among the cities in the Midwest and the East as well. What does all of these things mean? What do more recent migrations mean We have even seen since the pandemic a lot of activity in homes and people moving, and even just the demographics of Idaho in particular are changing in a very specific way as the country becomes more polarized politically. The other things I want to kind of use to help set the table is, when we look at education, for example, we had, and as a former K-12 teacher, we saw a great effort towards integration of schools from the mid 60s forward, yet informal segregation is higher than it's ever been in American schools. We also look at the way that voting precincts have been shaped, and questions of gerrymandering, and that impact on polarization, and then of course like the major demographic issues that are happening in our time, and that is that as a nation we are now, and we are certainly on our way to becoming a extremely diverse country. Generation Z is the first generation without an ethnic majority. It is a plurality, and the numbers that we've been throwing around since back in the day, it was like 2040, is when we're looking at a majority BIPOC nation. This transition is exciting to a lot of people, and it's scary as hell to some other people. You add on top of that the economic changes of the last generation, with the boomers being the last American generation to do better economically than their parents. That stopped with Gen Z, or Gen X, I'm sorry, those of us who are Gen X. And so from Gen X through millennials and Gen Z, we're looking at sometimes not as much prosperity as our parents, which is a huge switch in the American experience. So all of these things are colliding at once. So how does this all relate to our world of performing arts and presenting live experiences in theaters and festivals and other community spaces, and in the work of touring artists through communities that where the artist may feel right at home, in other communities where the artist may be part of a process of challenging and questioning a lot of the norms in that community. But before I jump into the next question, I want to just double check with the other panelists, Iquel and Camille. Anything you want to add to Teresa's table setting?
No, it was brilliant to listen. I'm wrestling around with some of the points that came out post Teresa's conversation. I think it's important to recognize, I know we'll switch to art making, but it's important to recognize that from the place where I sit as a Black person, a lot of those economic disparities, Tony, that you mentioned were strategic, right? And so, if you talk about baby boomer generation, like the disparity from baby boomers to today, immediately what jumps in my head is, the crack epidemic, right? Reaganomics, the forced placement of Black and brown folks or lower economic folks into high-rise tenements that were substandard qualities of living that contributed to poor health, poor hygiene, poor ability to educate in a proper way, because of those things are cyclical. Even to the 80s and 90s, where HIV and AIDS has decimated generations, to at least 2 generations of folks, primarily 2 generations of artists. And I think we have to be really critical about those things as well, playing into the economic situation that we live in right now. And I think sometimes that part of the conversation, the intentional economic displacement or economic, and sorry, I'm struggling for my words with this code, but the economic downturn for Black and brown communities was strategic by this country, and it's still playing out to this day. And unless we have that longitudinal conversation, we can sometimes compartmentalize and not put into context that this is a long fight that has to play out on all of these fronts. Also, the same thing with education, bell hooks. If Bell Hooks always argues if education in the United States was always based on the white narrative, then was integration actually the good thing for the Black and brown student, right? And so we have to critically interrogate those things too. Integration sounds wonderful, but when we put integration, especially around education, against going to same culture or same racialized schools, and not really wrestle around with what it means to be in an environment that will appreciate you and not fight against something else, we start to miss some of the critical nuances about why we're polarized.
Oh, go ahead.
Antonio, can I say wonderful points, Iquail, and the whole West Coast hip hop evolution, not East Coast, totally different story, but the whole West Coast hip hop evolution is about dealing with mass incarceration and the crack epidemic and et cetera. And I did not talk about the migration of African Americans into California and into the West, which is also an entirely different story. So it's like, oh my gosh, artistically, the profound influence of complete disenfranchisement of communities and how that impacted the art and impacted the music. Just had to say that.
Yeah, no, I mean, so much, I mean, at risk of spending the entire session on this first question, I think there's so many great points that are being brought up here, and that it also is the way that we connect this to our work and in the arts is how do these things impact the communities where we operate and the communities that we serve, or the communities we fail to serve, either through the what we choose to program, or even how we structure our programs and the geography of our programs. Iquail, as you were talking about the situation in schools and the pros and cons of integration, another layer I'm thinking about is the disparities. So teaching in the Oakland Flats, where our students, were 24 hours a day exposed to the pollution of the 880 industrial freeway and the only incinerator on the West Coast, medical incinerator. And so, it's so layered, but for presenters on the call, what is the homework you need to do to understand your community, both the community you have inherited and you're already serving, but perhaps those communities that are not being well served yet. Now, when we go to serve our community, all of us are working in a structure on both sides, the artist side and the presenter side. We're working in the structures of the current economic and social system, and to challenge those sometimes can be a difficult process. I want to take a moment, now that we've talked about polarization in the West and the many different ways that communities can be polarized. I want to look at what are the implications are for our various perspectives in the arts. And also I want to invite those who are joining the conversation today, please use the chat to post questions or comments. You're very much part of this dialogue today. But at this point, I'd like to look at this and say, given our polarized setting, and Camille, you're working in an extremely polarized setting, where you are, where the demographics of Idaho have a history and also some very current change that's very much driven by political polarization. Mm-hmm. Can you share a little bit of what are the implications of a polarized community from your perspective?
Yeah, and to speak to the comment about what the pandemic is doing for our community, we're getting the influx from the West Coast. So you've got the radical people complaining about the Californians, but in truth, we're getting the most conservative Californians who moved here to escape COVID restrictions and other things. It's creating an even more polarized situation. So, as I said before, my presenting series is out of the College of Southern Idaho in Twin Falls. And to just provide a little explanation about Twin Falls, we are a community in South Central Idaho. I believe the population tipped over to 50,000, which means we're no longer rural. We are, we're a small town now. We draw in from the surrounding, definitely surrounding rural communities for about 50 miles for our series. Twin Falls, Southern Idaho, Idaho in general, I mean, it goes without saying, has always historically been a very conservative population, predominantly Republican, predominantly religious, 25% Mormon and others. So you've got like this spirit of this, like that rugged independence that Teresa was talking about, but also, you know, you pair that with religious dogma and a place where everywhere you go, every waiting room of every lube shop or doctor's office is playing Fox News. Frankly, it's kind of created this mentality where a lot of the community thinks the same way, and it's not always conducive to quote unquote social justice type opportunities. So this has always been the case. I've always had to be careful about what we present, knowing my audience. For example, I presented Second City 15 years ago. I mean, it was Second City. It's an improv group. Why would it be like that? I did ask them to tone it down and not drop the F-bomb, and they didn't do that. But let me tell you, they did have a skit where I think the thing that riled people up was that God told weightlifters that gay people were okay. And people got up and left, and there was a letter to the editor, campaign against our series. People were approaching the president of the college. When I met the sponsor at an event, we were both laughing about getting t-shirts that said purveyor of filth and wearing them around. It's like, what do you do? And this is the type of community where if the theater department presents Legally Blonde, you get letters about having filth like that on stage because of the boobs and butt songs. When I first started the job, we did the vagina monologues. I got called into the president's office for sending an email saying tickets were available for something with the word vagina in it. We had an art installation that went along with that they had to take off campus and called it the ODS addendum, which I thought was clever. Love that. But this has always been how this community is. And those are kind of funny stories, and you can kind of laugh them off as a handful of older people. And I have for quite a long time. And you just kind of keep going and fight the good fight. You know, you get little old ladies saying too many shows weren't in English, so they're upset. It's just some little old ladies, right? So it's kind of funny and lighthearted. However, things started to change with this radical polarization that we've been talking about. So while in some ways the community is more relaxed about situations like that, with this extreme polarization, there's been a rise of the far-right political party. So, you know, the Patriots, the right-wing extremists, the 3%ers, John Birch Society, we've got them all here. And once again, they have, like say, there's the gerrymandering, but also closed primaries in Idaho. So with the closed primaries, political parties swing farther and farther and farther out. So we're in a pretty dangerous situation right here. You've heard of it in northern Idaho. It's not as bad as it is up there. You know, they're trying to create an entire community, the word out. It's not there, but we definitely have factions of it down here. And, you know, it's got its tendrils and its roots all over the country and kind of all over the world in some instances, this extremism. And if they see or hear about something that's not in lockstep with whatever their views are, and quite frequently they'll attach onto kind of like an outrage of the month, and that's what they'll attack. So if you are doing something that kind of flies in the face of that, and you get picked up locally, then you get picked up nationally, and then suddenly you're actually in kind of a dangerous situation. It's not just guys with souped up trucks with Confederate flag. We're in Idaho. Confederate flag is rolling. I mean, it's more than that. So to illustrate this fact, This kind of all was starting to come to a head back in 2017. I'm sharing this. It's a little disturbing, but it also, I think, illustrates the issue nicely. In 2017, we had an incident here in Twin Falls. It ended up making international headlines, where there were a group of refugee teens, preteens, and a refugee girl, and something happened. Something happened in a washroom. They're minors. You can't know, it's sealed. So the police report was sealed. My husband, who was mayor at the time, didn't know the details because it's a case of minors, right? Well, somebody picked it up on the police scanner and suddenly it was all over national news. And once again, we were in the crosshairs of the rabid chaos of the crowd. So this just shows you, so suddenly, you know, my husband, the city council, and everybody, it gets blown out of proportion. And then the threats come. And every night my husband and I would sit and read the hundreds of emails and letters that he was getting and the death threats. And it was really traumatizing. And then of course they glommed onto CSI because we kind of are an umbrella organization for the refugee program and singled out individual people that they titled as Muslim extremists. And that's all the mob sees, the Muslim extremists. Apparently my husband and I were like the ringleaders, but to kind of give you an idea, and you know, it's scary. I want to say it's not scary, but it is scary. And if you'll indulge me, I came to work about 3 days into it and had this voicemail on my phone. So if you don't mind, I'm going to hit play on this.
Being a good dad.
That's my
being
husband.
a good husband.
It's coming up.
It consumed me.
And then
Yes, good afternoon, Ms. Berger.
his wife one day showed up at work and sat down and hit play on her voicemail.
I wonder, Ms. Berger, if your residence was posted online and your whereabouts identified, how you would feel if half a dozen Muslim men raped and sodomized you, Ms. Berger. And when you tried to scream, broke every tooth in your mouth. And then I wonder how you'd feel if when you went to the Twin Falls Police Department, they told you to run along, that this is simply cultural diversity, don't you know? Recently, a woman, member of parliament, Jo Cox, in England, who advocates the absolute inundation of her country with the lowest common denominator humanity has to offer, so-called refugees, she met with opposition in the form of a bullet to the head. She's dead now. They buried her.
So it was scary. As I was saying with Teresa, I recognize it took us about a month to come to terms to the fact of, oh, well, aren't you so lucky that you waited this long to get it? People of color, LGBTQ face this all the time, but it was really scary. Alex Jones embedded a Breitbart reporter. The Russian bots created fake rallies. It was terrifying. And the sentiment has only grown worse since then with the radicalization. There were similar uprisings, as I said, the moment with, you know, the COVID response, they even turned against their idol, Republican governor, still the refugee thing. We thought the refugees were these, like, I just saw it as this beautiful population that's enhancing the community, and that's not how it's gotten spun. So, and of course, now the latest one is what they call the social justice wokeism and critical race theory. Ammon Bundy also, by the way, now comes down with his 150 armed followers to protest events that he feels are too socially woke, and he'll even come to your house. So he won't just come to your venue or your location, but to your own residence. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. The other new thing that is making it kind of perilous to present here in Idaho, the CSI, is that education has come into the crosshairs. So again, the right-wing people have glommed onto this, the lieutenant governor, and for what they see as critical race theory, anything that makes the white kids feel bad. That's what they call it. And they have severely restricted the funding for the higher institutions. my institution is okay, but I always have to be aware of that. If I presented heavily a season that had those kind of messages, it could result in loss of funding for my institution. Certainly bad will from those people, although I don't care about that. So that's always, every time I'm programming, a season, and it's so interesting working here in this rural frontier community with these right-wing sentiments, but the people that I do business with, agents, artists, presenters are up and down the West Coast and live in a very different world. And so it's difficult to explain, like I just can't go that far. And if I did that at some point, just push, not only are we all in danger, we lose funding and I lose my audience. So, I'm not saying I don't present people of color. My beautiful last show that we presented right before COVID was that We Shall Overcome, Martin Luther King tribute. It was just amazing. We have a little side series where we do kind of more shows that push the envelope a little bit, and we're fearless on that. People know kind of, like what they're getting there. We've had Darren Perry speaking about the Bear River Massacre. We did outreach with prisoners for 2 years. That's another thing to talk about with creative writing, and it turned into a big community education thing to swing the needle a little bit. But yeah, I think you just have to be very careful about how much, when, and how far you can actually push in a polarized community.
Thank you, Camille, for sharing kind of the state of challenge in where you're at. And I want to turn it back over to the panel for reflections on some of the things that Camille has shared.
I was going to say it is true, and thank you for saying that, Camille. That of course, LGBTQ people of color experience hostility, death threats, but it does not minimize the fact that you experience trauma. It's horrifying how people treated you simply for just doing your job well and trying to do the right thing. It's filtering into everything. It's literally everywhere. I just started my classes at the U yesterday, and I have 2 really large classes, 230 students and 120 students in my intro to sociology and my exploring inequality through music and film. And I just said, in the music and film class, I'm like, we're going to talk about critical race theory, and this is not a state that's conducive to that, but I'm at a university and these are students and they want to hear this. They're excited to hear it. It's not a situation where someone's going to stand up and yell at me or now, if I speak in the community, that's it. I'll totally get, death threats and hate. But I am working in a situation at the U where people are learning about white privilege, and they're learning about gender privilege, and they're learning about, queer population. So talking about it yesterday didn't feel in the least bit brave, nor did I expect it to. It just felt like there are many theories, and this is one of them. And we had a great discussion in that class just on the first day. I think that younger people just want to hear this. They want to hear it. They want to learn it. It's not all of them, but the students that are taking classes in sociology, at least my classes and other classes. So I'm sorry that you had to go through this needless, ridiculous, horrifying situation for ideological BS, really, honestly.
And the chat just came up, how difficult it is to present, but I mean, it's not all gloom and doom. My audience, we sell a really strong season ticket. It's sold 700 season tickets for this year already, have sold out 3 or 4 of the shows. And we'll talk about that later, I guess. They're wonderful. They're lovely. It's the fringy people I have to worry about.
Can I also speak, Tony, if that's okay? Again, I echo Teresa's comments, Camille. I was moved to tears at how horrible a situation that you had to experience. It is trauma for you and deserves to be respected as such, and it's hate and it's vile, and it deserves to be excommunicated from our society. At the same time, I'm moved to tears in listening to your experience, recognizing that while although I haven't received those phone calls directly, I know people who have, who are Black and brown, just teaching kids, University of Maryland. Um, but I also know that since 1619, and perhaps a little bit before, Black people in this country have lived under that same thing until today, still continue to live under those threats. And I moved to tears that Black people in particular, Indigenous folks in particular, have yelled from the top of their lungs, put their blood in the soil and in the sand, asking for recognition that that is their experience from hate groups, KKK, and neighbors. Let's be quite transparent. It's not just the named known groups that we know. It's the colleague you work with. It is the daily microaggressions, but literally I'm imagining what it must have been like from 1619 until today to have to send your kids to school and get spit on and thrown rocks at, or to walk past to a supermarket and get shot just to get shrimp, or go to church and praise and worship in the safe space where you are in. And whether you're in 1960, you get bombed and 4 girls get killed, or you're in 2018, and some random white guy comes and kills 9 people by shooting them up. And it takes George Floyd getting killed on TV in order, 400 years of people saying that this has been their experience, for people to start to believe it. And then it comes and then it goes. And so I'm pained that, and it still happens. It's still happening right now today. And then it'll just be a trend, and then it'll go away. But that experience, I'm thankful you shared it. And I just want to elevate that Black people and historically are still living with that right now today. Imagine just walking your child to school and watching a body being strung up from a tree and swing. And then you're a little kid and you have to live with that trauma and pass that trauma down willingly and unwittingly, like you pass down DNA. And that's the condition, at least I can speak for a lot of Black folks that come and live a life in communities where I live. But even reading that stories, one more thing I must say, and I'm gonna shut up. Just myth dispelled, and this isn't to anybody here, but it comes up. I'm also a PhD researcher, and I just want to say that no one teaches critical race theory. Critical race theory is a theoretical framework by which to look at society through the lens of racialized culture, to teach American history as the truth. And sometimes and I listen to the conversations, and it's as if critical race theory is an actual theory that we can name, that we can define. But law schools have created the term critical race theory as a way to get people to see a situation and how race is implicated. And there is no class on critical race theory. There are classes on American history. And that's what our kids are being taught, American history.
So there's a lot to digest here. From the, kind of the rawness of that, what Camille, what you experienced, to kind of the kind of theoretical table setting that we have, in terms of what Teresa and Quayle have shared in terms of, the state of education. I'm certainly thinking about this too. A lot of the things I wrote for national PBS productions on race and identity won't even be used in certain states anymore, because they are labeled that idea of that term, as Quayle, you were saying, that the critical race theory has become the baiting term, to strike down all kinds of academic investigations of what is our shared American story, which is not always a pretty story, right? And so so this idea of, what it has become this very kind of knee-jerk thing. Now, add to this whole, that we're living in this, early stage social media, you could call it, right? Which leads not only to these lightning terms like critical race theory, but also to this kind of crowdsourced bullying tactics that we see, where people from all over the country, or even bots from other parts of the world, are just raining down on a community or an individual. Um, and the other tactic of using personal addresses and things like that, and depending on where we are in certain issues, we may feel strongly one way or another, about these things. And and so all of these things are in play. Um, I'm thinking about now from a touring artist point of view, to navigate and to go from the home community to varying communities where you may serve as a visiting artist. Um, what does this mean to work in a polarized setting where you're just literally going, sometimes night to day, through the course of a week? Iquel, would you share a little bit from an artist perspective about what it means to move through a polarized setting?
Yeah, thank you for that. Listening to Camille and reading, there was a comment in the chat about another presenter, similar experience in Wyoming. Dance Iquel has a gig to go to Wyoming at Sheridan. And so now I'm like, oh, maybe I want to start visiting places first before, kind of sign up. And not about Wyoming or these places, but just I think the artist now is becoming hyper aware about the value that they bring to the space, and then also whether or not to be in that space, whether that space will be conducive to them as an artist. I know that I'm thinking of that very intently, very intentionally. There's a couple things that I want to say. My brain is foggy, so I'm gonna apologize. I'm gonna try to be quick. I think in polarized settings, the first myth to dispel is the relationship of community to low budget. And so sometimes we talk about community work, community work, community work, community work. And then somehow for the artists working with presenters, there is that is supposed to be somehow cheaper or free. And I think that if we're talking about changing or reworlding out of a polarized nation, then we have to put more of our money, if we're going to be capitalistic, behind that work, and not relate community, especially geographic communities of historically marginalized experiences, as somehow free. I think we should shift that. Secondly, I'm gonna name a couple companies, and then I'll say why I'm naming them. When I think of Dance Theater of Harlem, Soul Defined, Step Africa, Philadanco, To Dance, Balethnic, Dance Iquel, Camille A. Brown, Grupo Corpo, Bangara Dance Theater. These are 10 Black companies. And what I see, and I hope everybody takes away, that those are 10 vastly different aesthetic presentations, ways of working, and communities. And the reason I'm saying that is because sometimes we conflate Blackness or Black companies as only in the socio-political sphere, which also, as a presenter, I would say we should challenge that notion. If we're only thinking of Blackness as the thing that pushes the boundary on the socio-political side around mass incarceration, HIV, sort of these social issues, then we're doing it a disservice to see the diversity and the broad depth that these Black run and Black servicing companies have. Which brings me to a specific ask of presenters: stop giving Black companies only one spot on your season, because you're perpetuating the same narrative. Even if you are progressive, you're perpetuating the same racist ideologies that continue to make our communities polarized. because we only see Blackness as one type of thing. But I just named 10 companies that are vastly different. Grupo Corporal in Brazil does not do the same work as Dance Theater Harlem, and neither of them do the same work as Philadelphia or Soul Defined or South Africa. And if you don't know those names, those are only 10. There are hundreds, right? So how do we start to build relationships with them, those companies, and start to see Blackness not as one thing, not as the thing that is opposite whiteness, but see Blackness as Zanetta Drew from Dallas Black would say, as the inclusion, the absorption of all things, and then the representation of that diversity. And so that's the second thing. The third thing that I was going to say is escaping me right now. And it was good. Oh my goodness. Oh, I think we said this on the call. I think for an artist, we got to be really critical of artists as well, because we like to believe that artists, the artistic world, managers, agents, makers, doers, are actually progressive. And based on the way that voting happens in the United States over federal elections for president, and the closeness with which that happens is an indication that artists are continuing to perpetuate the same social ills that we're talking about as non-artists do, right? Homophobia is rampant in the arts world. Transphobia is rampant in the arts world. Anti-Blackness, anti-dark-skinnedness is rampant in the arts world. And who's perpetuating that? It's artists, right? And we have to be really critical as artists and as arts administrators and professionals about our own particular biases and the way we bite into those narratives and perpetuate the thing while saying we're trying to fight against it. And all of this, to get to your question, is what lands on me as an artist, right? And I look at spaces, right? We talked about whether or not, what is the artist's duty to call someone out or pull them in? Like, when do you make that decision? As a Black person, the only thing that I can say is to call someone in. Those two things have application. One is a singular action, right? Pushing against something is just me, right? I can push against you and it's my own action, my own accountability, right? Depending on how tough or malleable the thing is that I'm pushing against will ultimately dictate my impact. But to call someone in requires multi-directional willingness and engagement to be called in. Otherwise, I am pulling you against your agency, against your will, and I'm hurting myself trying to drag you along. And so the idea we like to adopt, call someone in, I can't call anyone in unless you're willing to participate in the call in, right? And then, you know, historically we can see like what the ramifications of that are on artists about whether or not you go to a venue or you don't go to a venue. And what I mean by that is, you know, there are tons of stories of Catherine Dunham documenting the Dunham experience, going to the Deep South and refusing to perform unless people were of her community, racial community, were allowed to sit in the, not in the mezzanine, but in the orchestra, right? And she took that at great risk. It made a change for her, and we celebrated the fact that she did that. On the flip side of that, we don't talk about Dr. Pearl Primus, who was doing that work as well, but was painted a red, was stoned, was alienated, had her passport revoked. And we rarely ever talk about her in history, right? Unless you're in those communities that deeply honor her, like a community that I'm in. And so those are just two examples about, you know, I can't offer which one the artist should do. I think for Dance Aquel, I'm always about protecting my people as well, my artists, the people that come with me. So I have a great sense of responsibility to protect them and not put them in situations that might subject them to harm just because I feel it might be useful to go to this deeply red state and perform this work. Because that's disingenuous to them and it's anti the values of creating social change. It actually is.
Oh, did I quail freeze for you all?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just right on the tip of my seat. we're gonna we're gonna hope that iQuail's connection comes back through. Um, Yeah. There we are. There we are. And you're
See,
like, and the key to universe is.
but you see how the world works. Like, you know, my computer didn't mess up at all until I started speaking, right? But I guess again, the same thing exists, right? So we talk about this is a thing for artists. Oh yeah, like let's do virtual things, virtual things. I am at a college right now in my office that has a lot of electric, a lot of Wi-Fi, and my Wi-Fi is still cut off. What is that doing for the communities we're trying to serve as well, who don't have access to Wi-Fi in their homes or computers or electricity, right? All of these things. So sorry, I'm gonna pause there, but I apologize about the Wi-Fi. But you know, sometimes the universe gives you an example, right? And so if it's happening to me at a college, what is it? What's happening to the person I'm trying to reach on the south side of Chicago or in North Omaha or in you know, Navajo Nation? Like, and these things are what we need to work with presenters to do, and also reach them in the spaces where they're comfortable, right? Because ultimately there's a lot of work that has to happen in order to get them comfortable coming to other spaces. And so I want to encourage presenters listening to work really across those lines to find the communities that want to experience the work that you're trying to do with giving access to knowledge in a different way by using art. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Iquel. A lot of powerful points in terms of this tension too between, you know, as artists, to what extent are we called to, you know, go out to do the work, right? To kind of have this um, this role as, you know, as frankly as people to people exchange ambassadors, essentially, because nothing breaks down assumptions and stereotypes like being with someone, right? And, you know, ideally breaking bread with someone, things like that. That's how we break things down. But when doing that, just the act of doing that is, you know, you have to consider, like, am I putting my artist in harm? And or on the presenter side, you know, as Camille mentioned, the presenter has to think about, well, how far can I push before I'm going to lose my funding, or they're going to replace me with someone else who's a, you know, like more of a yes man kind of programmer. Those are challenging questions. And Iquel, the other thing I wanted to address was what you had brought up. I think it was in conversation with Lexus in Wyoming about, you know, what is the role of education? And I have, again, as an educator, I want to lean on this. Um, to what extent are performing arts organizations going to help continue the good work of understanding the legacy of American history? You know, a sober understanding of American history, not a simplified patriotic version of it. As more and more school districts are, you know, basically stepping away from that third rail. You know, what is our role through residencies? And, you know, given the fact that more presenters are looking at relationship as an important part of their work. So moving away from the transaction of, like, you buy a ticket and that's as far as my connection is to you, to like relationship with community. How do all these pieces fit together? I don't know that I have the answer, but I know that they're all related. I want to take a moment just to acknowledge some of the comments and questions that have been coming in. Lots of things coming in. Leah talks about being concerned about the safety of artists in communities where sundown laws have never been struck. Um, and then let's see, we have another question from Ed when we talk about, um, can we, you know, as we re-envision our audiences to be more inclusive of people that may have not been historically, you know, part of our audience, so to speak, will that help break down this notion of, well, our audience won't accept these artists? And so those are a couple questions on the table. I see another comment coming in. Um, and so, but I want to go
Tony,
back to our panelists and just get thoughts on some of these comments and questions so far.
Tony, can you just repeat the one, the last I can't find it. The one about rejecting the artist. Can you repeat that one, please?
Oh yeah, that's in the Q&A section. So the question is, when we talk about our audience as the basis of a presenting organization's financial model, how do you envision the evolution and changes in the audience, current and prospective, that might eliminate the idea that, quote, our audience won't accept these artists? So that idea of as we expand our audiences to be more demographically inclusive, will that self-correct to a certain extent the idea of our audiences won't accept such and such artist?
Yeah, I know. I was reading that question and thinking through it. I mean, certainly I'm aware that my audience, like over 60 and white, but I only do like 8, 9 shows a year. And so I just have been carefully curating it through the years to get a little more progressive, a little more towards the younger demographic. So as not to alienate the old people. Here's the thing, what I wish? I wish that I had like a big pot of money. I would, if I had $100,000 a year, I'd be presenting the crap out of this, like, here's your other side series that's more this and more like younger people and something that's a little more progressive or that has meanings of social intent. That's the other factor too, is that the money issue, and how do we go about getting to do the right thing and presenting these arts experiences if we're going to lose a lot of money doing it. That's part of the conversation. Then you also lose your job and you close up shop. I don't know. That might sound cold and crass, but I think presenters will know what I'm talking about. Equal, I did want to say your artist would be very safe and loved here. It's just me. Gets my butt handed to me.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm sure they will. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate that, Camille.
I there's a couple things I want to address. I want to also acknowledge some of the comments that are coming in now. Lexus mentioned that we have a responsibility as presenters to both, I guess, in a sense, give our audiences some of the things they want, and then also, to serve them a well-rounded diet, so to speak. So, they're going to get their chicken strips, but they also need to have some vegetables and quinoa.
I have to say that
and it can be delicious.
that's where having a really strong season ticket, it's positive. Give you your big spectacle fun shows, and I always program something that will push them a little bit, 2 or 3 things, and they're along for the ride and they learn and they might only enjoy something else. I love that.
I want to also come back to the idea that a couple other things, and that is a good point in terms of coming back to something that Iquel mentioned earlier, which is like, hey, there's multiple companies, we all have different approaches, and that's just in the world of black-led dance companies. I mean, let alone the full spectrum of performing arts and subgenres that we're talking about. And this question always, for those of us that perform in quote unquote ethnic art forms, there's always this idea of like, hey, we're here 12 months a year, and and let me tell you, like, playing Mexican music and Dia de los Muertos comes around, like, I get more 24 hours in that day. But the other thing that I wanted to address in terms of Camille, your approach of booking or programming the season so that you're hooking the legacy audiences, so to speak, the legacy audience, the established kind of more middle to upper class white audiences, older, to hook them with the season, and then the other thing too is that for the financial models presenters, think about to what extent are you selling a season, to what extent are you selling individual shows, and to what extent are you diversifying your income so you are not completely reliant on ticket sales? To what extent have you invested in mid and major donors? that share your philosophy, your programming philosophy. To what extent are you bringing them along? And then to what extent are you connecting with school district or social benefit organizations that you could go in on grants together for educational content or other community content? Those are some ways to address that question of that financial barrier.
Um,
Oh, go ahead.
Antonio, I was going to say two different things from completely different kind of standpoints. In rock and roll history, really, actually, rock and roll comes from the blues and enslavement. So all through American history, there's been artists who have pushed the envelope in terms of resistance, right? Blues artists, rhythm and blues artists, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, B.B. King, but also, the British invasion and folk rock and Dylan and, folk rockers, psychedelic rock, the Grateful Dead, all of these artists, all the way to, my gosh, punk rock and hip hop and MTV, have been pushing the envelope. And these are forms of resistance that have been part of our culture, and they're still part of our culture, and they're still ongoing, right? That's on one side. The other is I'm on 2 theater boards here in Salt Lake City, and I watched them. One of them is Pioneer Theater Company, and one of them is Salt Lake Acting Company. Very different, one very big, one very small. Lot of tension and discussion over diversity, inclusion, and equity. Lots of tension. Will that turn away our, constant discussions of that go on all the time in those board meetings, which I find quite fascinating. And also, I know for a fact, I know that part of the reason I was invited onto those boards is because they want people of color on those boards, which I'm happy to do because I really respect both groups. But this tension of, is my life being threatened? This tension of, am I going to survive this? This tension of, will I be able to make a living, are very real and valid. And I think we need to respect people's choices, I respect the fact that people are putting themselves out there with their artwork, but I also know that, sometimes you cannot. It's kind of the same with teaching. When I first started teaching here at the U in 1990, you did not say certain things or do certain things. I still kind of I definitely pushed the envelope. I had faculty who hated me because they thought I was too radical for teaching about racism. And yet I was also very cognizant of the fact that that was a tenure track position and that I needed to get tenure, you understand? So I think we need to respect that tension and respect that artists have choices, that they have to be aware of their own lives, their own skins, their own food for their families. And I think that it's going to always be a constant tension. But I think it's easy to judge people as opposed to just kind of understanding where they're coming from. In the film, Lee Daniels, The Butler, people in the civil rights movement were kind of making fun of butlers, right? Making fun of butlers in the White House. And Dr. King said, no, these are people who are pioneers. These are people who paved the way for so many other people. We need to understand where they were sitting, what they were going through. And I just wanted to add that.
Teresa, listen, I would talk to you anytime. We should get on. We should collaborate on some academic articles or something. Let's go. As you said that, I was just kind of thinking I want to elevate. One thing that one of my students said when we were doing a Beyonce course, the college loved it. And I love it.
Yes.
And it brings in so many students because they're like, oh, you're using Beyonce. As critical framework to analyze race, culture, society, and gender. I also use Kendrick Lamar, who I also love too.
Oh God, yes.
But at the same time, the student said, American society, and American in his definition is both North and South America, loves Black people, loves Black culture, but does not love Black people.
Yes. Yes.
And we just sat there and we talked. And in that conversation, what came up was, there is no way to talk about the United States or the Northern Hemisphere situation without recognizing that it is always, has always been, and will always be influenced by Blackness and indigeneity or indigenousness.
Yes.
Right? Clear, like, look at what the names of some of your streets are in your town, right? Or the names of some of the rivers. In Baltimore, the Susquehanna. In Philly, the Schuylkill. So the Delaware, the
In
Conestoga.
Utah.
Utah, right? Ohio, Seminole, you know, on and on and on and on. And so every day we're dealing with indigenous culture, but then somehow we don't think that we know how to speak, right? Or that we don't know anything about these cultures, or we can't contextualize them. Yes, they are not visible, and we need to talk about land back and those things, right? Yes, we talk a lot about the Navajo and the Cherokee, at least in the communities where I go, but we have to dispel the myth that, oh, we don't know anything about these cultures. If you live in the US, you know about it. You know about it, right? Same thing with Black art. You have to recognize that everybody in the United States is dealing with Blackness every day. If you turn on the TV, if you see graffiti art, if you have murals in your city, if you have different types of music, from rock and roll to bluegrass to gospel to Christian, all of that is affected by Blackness and indigeneity, right? If you have a block party on your street, that is Blackness. If you do street festivals, these things come out of the African American experience in the United States. And so everybody is always dealing with Black art and indigenous art. And I think it's time to lean into it and not lean away from it.
I think I think that's an excellent. I was trying to think, you know, how are we going to lift this as we end? And that is it. That is the brocha de oro, as we say sometimes in Spanish, the golden medallion at the end of it. So thank you, everyone, to the entire panel. But what a powerful note to end on is that, like, we're already in it. This is not something that we are importing necessarily, but we are already, no matter where we are, whether our state is called Wyoming or California, or whatever our location is, we are already in this conversation and in this narrative. And how can we lean into it instead of choosing or letting others choose to have us lean out of it?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Tim, I'm sure you have some closing words you want to share.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Teresa, Aquel, and Camille for joining us. And I want to thank the audience. I also need to thank Seattle Theater Group that sponsored today's panel. So thank you to Seattle Theater Group, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this important conversation. This session was recorded. We'll, in a day or two, we'll have it posted within the conference platform so people that missed it can watch it. And we'll share it soon after the conference on our Vimeo and YouTube channels. But thank you, everyone. Thanks for a great panel. We'll see you soon. And Aquel, I hope you're feeling better. And I would send you some chicken soup, at least in my imagination. So you feel better. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Camille, I'm gonna email you, Camille.
I know. I've got some ideas.